Standard format is not competitive is the title of this video in quotation marks, and I hope that you know that quotation marks do mean that I don't necessarily agree with that statement or that we're trying to add a little bit more to it. But today's video is going to be one that I know will be treading over dangerous territory, so I will say from the very beginning that I'm going to be playing devil's advocate in this video. I want this game to be as competitive as it can be and to feel rewarding for decisions. You know, I want to feel rewarded for making the right plays, and when I play other card games like Shadow vs. Evolve, again, I'm an ambassador, I know it sounds like I'm shilling, but I feel very rewarded for the plays I make. I feel like I can look back on the game states, I can look back on like the turns that happened throughout the game and go, oh, that's where I took a risk and it didn't pay off and I lost because of it. Or it's like, oh, there I should have pushed instead and I would have won if I did. Things like that. But recently, if you've been keeping up with some of the discourse in the community, in particular on Twitter or X, depending on what you want to call it, there's definitely been a little bit of discussion about, you know, is standard competitive? Is, you know, this game with, you know, the format has become so hyper aggressive, has less defensive mechanics compared to the other ones, although they are slowly showing improvements with some of the generics like the carbuncles and the more recent cycle cards. But, you know, we've seen an interest in maybe exploring defensive plays, such as the Gorgon ride line. But at the end of the day, the current format is quite fast, it is quite aggressive, and there aren't enough defensive options, where sometimes you look at your 7-card hand and you see 4 cards without shield, and you are facing 5 attacks, and you know that you simply can't survive, and there was nothing that you could really do against it. You got crit in turn 2, and you couldn't stop it. You didn't have enough hand. And that's just, you know, and you lost to essentially just a bad compilation of luck. But so, what brought this discussion on today is quite a few factors, but one of them was a pretty popular thread by everyone's favorite, WCC Kai, where he also made a video out of this, which I highly recommend you watch as well if you want to kind of add more to your thoughts about this entire, you know, debacle. But I want to give you a quick brief rundown of what he wrote about in his thread. So it all kind of started with, we had a deluxe qualifier here in Japan, where you basically saw 15 different decks in the top 16, with the only one deck that was clashing was Youthberg. But keep in mind that decks that don't exist in the top cut are prioritizing these. That's what Diversity Cut is. Diversity Cut looks at which decks are undefeated, and then it will prioritize the decks from the X1 line, the one loss line, to put them into the top cut because they don't clash. So that's why you see such a beautiful, diverse pie chart. And so people immediately go like, whoa, look at this diversity. There are so many different decks. This is a healthy format because so many different decks can top. And quite a few of these decks can actually top, right? Even without Diversity Cut, if we look at some of the Japanese format, set 13 format results, there are quite a few that can do this as well. For example, this was a WGP in Malaysia, where we can basically see that, again, there is quite a few different decks in here, right? There's quite a few different decks, and again, there's quite a lot of representation as well here. But so then people of course saw that and they started going like, haha, all of you said set 13 would be a horrible format and it would be, you know, just the like turn 4 decks beating everything and it'd be super fast. Look at all this diversity. And of course, it caused responses such as John saying, I'm convinced people are going to go, it's diverse so the format is healthy, and not understand why that's not an indicator of a healthy format. In fact, it's the opposite. And of course, people were elaborating, but I think one of the best elaborators was actually Kai, who then went and said that people do not understand that diversity should not be the determining factor as to whether a format is healthy. What should determine whether a format is healthy or not is if correct decisions made in game are rewarded or not. And I do agree with this, but a very important piece of nuance is that this is talking about the health of a format in regards to competitive play. This does not mean for a more, let's say, somebody that's just engaging with the game, you know, on weekends, you know, somebody that just wants to play with their friends, that wants to be like, okay, I can play deck A and you will play deck B and we'll be on a pretty similar playing field, right? In terms of having fun, it's not going to be like, you know, I'm playing a tier 0 deck and you're playing a tier 4 deck and, you know, I'm always going to be winning, and therefore that fun playing a game experience gets ruined by the big difference. For someone that wants to engage with a game more casually, again, this is a very dangerous word. The word casually is very, very, you know, it's like throwing fire at every single direction all of a sudden. But it's like, if me and a friend want to just play some casual games of Vanguard, choosing any one of these decks, you know, against one of the others is going to have, you know, a pretty fun experience, right? But then when you start to think about competitive play, it becomes a different story, because then, you know, you're basically going into this argument of, well, you know, what Kai basically talks about. So Kai, of course, goes into depth quite a bit. So basically talking about correct decisions being rewarded, right? So you want it to be that you engage with the game more and more, and you learn about it more and more, so that you learn how to make better decisions, and those better decisions are rewarded. You win more because you make more better decisions. But because there's so much power output and so little defensive output, a lot of games end pretty early due to lack of shield, and we've talked about this before too. So, and then, you know, your opponent flips an early crit or OT, or, you know, tri-lanes you and you don't hit a defensive. Well, you basically lost a turn of your lifespan. The game's gonna end on turn 4 because you're on 3 damage on turn 2, and you're gonna just get 5 attacks swung at you again next turn, right? So it's like, as he says, it doesn't matter how good of a player you are or what deck you play, it simply doesn't add up. So that's why we have this hyper-aggressive meta right now. So what does this lead to? We're seeing very good numbers for players at BCS for Standard, but there's been more V Premium players, and a lot of veteran players have been choosing to play it as well. Is it because V Premium is a free invite to Worlds? To Worlds, not exactly. But players feel that, you know, they're more confident because their decisions are more rewarded in Premium and V. Especially V doesn't have the over triggers, that's another big variance part that is taken out of it entirely. So he also talks about deck building, but I think that's a completely different topic for that I'm not going to get into it. This video will become way too long. But overall, yes, I think variance is less impactful. I think V did a good job of rebalancing itself after a very horrible format in the past year. And now you have a more open playing field, and it does feel more rewarding. The only problem is that there's no new cards, so it does get a little bit stale, I think, if you really want to engage into it as your main format. So then Kai says, I mean, you might be saying topping V in Premium is easier because there's less players and less rounds, but that's not the case because the people you're facing are going to be some of the bigger veterans, right? They've committed a lot of effort to this format. They've put in the time to make sure they can top, and that's why they chose to play this instead of the more populated Standard format where they have, you know, obviously, you know, winning an event of 30 players versus winning an event of 300 players. The average, you know, observer from outside will go, wow, you were the first out of 300? That's amazing. Versus like, oh, you're the first out of 30? Cool. You know, it's like the reaction is already a bit different, right? Number 1 out of 300, number 1 out of 1,000 is different than number 1 out of 50, right? And that's kind of part of that discussion too, in my opinion. So furthermore, he says there'll be more players who have a wealth of experience as a baseline. If you haven't put time to learn the format, you'll likely not do as well. Guess what? The players who play the premium formats do well in Standard too. They top everything. And I think a part that he kind of skips out on here is that, yes, the players choosing to play V in Premium are the ones that have a bigger wealth of knowledge. But then, if I'm a Standard player that got into Vanguard, let's say in this past year, and I'm choosing to start taking, you know, going to Vanguard events and traveling for it, and you tell me that, like, if I haven't put in time to learn, so like it feels like this whole thread is talking about why people are choosing to play V in Premium and why Standard is problematic competitively. Choosing to say this and saying it's like, okay, if you haven't learned the format, then you won't do well. It's like, so again, that means I'll just play Standard then, because I can't beat these people who've put in the time, and therefore I will stand a better chance in Standard, where it's like, getting lucky sometimes will just win me the game. I don't even have to put in that much time and effort, right? And whether that's a bad or a good thing, we'll talk about in a second. I just want to go through his thread first. So he says those players don't want variance being the reason why they don't get to Worlds, and, you know, they want to have as much control as they can. So they pick the formats with less variance. This makes sense. This is why games that reward player skill are popular as well, right? And of course, he says, before you pass off Vanguard as a luck game, there's many players that make Worlds every year, and if there wasn't skill involved in this, that wouldn't be happening, right? So it's always the best players that know how to manage their luck as well. So he's curious to see how many players are going to re-qualify for Standard Worlds this time, and he says that Standard's doing a good job because new faces are always coming in, and it's a game that brings a lot of new players in as well. So as a format of bringing in new blood, it's doing its job. So he says, why should we care about diversity? Diversity is like food. It could taste great, but if it looks bad, no one will eat it unless cooked by a partner. Tier 0 metas that involve lots of skill are great for competitive players, but are an anathema for casual players, right? So when you have a Tier 0 meta where it's just like one deck over everything else, competitive players like it because it's easy to test into it. You know what you have to beat, and you know how to approach it. Whereas if we look at the previous pie chart of like 16 different decks in the format, preparing for that is really hard. You have to like test for like so many different matchups. You have to always think about like, okay, I have to make sure I beat this and this and this and this, have enough practice against this and this and this, because you never know what you're going to play against, right? But for a more casual player, it's fun because there's more decks to choose from in order to have fun with a game, right? So he basically says that we need to balance gameplay and diversity so that both casual and competitive players are engaged and people have options while still maintaining deep and engaging gameplay that keeps players around, which I think is correct, right? The diversity can keep somebody that is less competitive around, whereas that deep and engaging gameplay is what will keep the competitive players sticking around as well, instead of switching to other formats or switching to other games. And he also says that, you have to balance this in this day and age because there's so many TCGs around that you have to balance this, right? If everyone is competitive, so this is a very important tweet in my opinion, where he says, no casuals means no money and no players, right? That's kind of like the oopsie that Battle Spirit Saga sort of run into. It over advertised its competitive scene so much that only competitive players play it. And I've heard from my friends that the level of sharking in these events in Battle Spirit Saga is horrible because of how competitive the game is. But, so it's like you really need the casual scene to actually grow the game. But if you don't have a competitive scene, then what's the goal, right? What are we actually aiming for? Are we just playing for fun? You need that kind of goal for players that want to go a little bit beyond casual as well, just to engage, to get that thrill out of it too. So there's so many TCGs that you have to cater to both. And so he kind of wraps up the thread on that sense. So there's a few points that I want to pick up on from this thread a little bit and really kind of give light to it. And again, he has a video himself where he talks about this in more depth that you should watch as well. But let's just pick up on a couple things. So I already brought up the idea of like, I might as well play standard if all the good players are playing V and premium, right? That just makes my chance as a less engaged player higher, right? I think we like to kind of really draw lines between casual and competitive, as if there is no in-between. But the in-between, I think, is the biggest, because you have people that just play with friends, and you have people that are the top competitive players. But there's a lot of people that are like, well, I'm technically, a bit more casual. I work a 9 to 5, I have to take care of my family or, my pets or whatever. So I only have this much time to play the game. Maybe it's once a week, maybe it's just on weekends, maybe it's once every 2 weeks, right? So I only have so much time for the game, but I have a thrill for competitive play. I really like engaging in competition, and being able to do well is really fun, and I enjoy that. And I can tell you from my perspective, I put in a lot of time into TCGs, and I do see myself as a competitive player, and therefore really like games and formats where I feel like I can look back on good plays and bad plays and really reflect, right? It feels very rewarding to play that kind of game, and my time feels rewarded too. But there's another genre of games that I really like, which is fighting games. And for fighting games, unfortunately, because I put in so much time into other things, right? I don't have as much time to engage in fighting games. And as a result, when I play fighting games that don't have as many mechanics that reward, let's say, beginner players or give more leeway for less experienced players to still be able to fight, it feels demotivating because I will always lose. I will always lose against the better player, and I'm not Tokido or Daigo or Punk. I'm not someone that can put in, crazy amounts of time and take fighting games as like a full-time thing. I just want to play them sometimes, and I do want to feel good about myself, but at the same time, if I always just get beat, it's not going to be a very fun experience. So a lot of more modern fighting games have been kind of approaching this idea of like, okay, how do we reward players that aren't as engaged and give them a chance to win sometimes, right? Do we pump up the damage numbers like Guilty Gear Strive? Do we add more easier to understand and ways of using controls like Granblue Versus or Street Fighter 6 with the modern mechanics? It's like, there's different ways to approach this, and there is almost an appeal for this kind of gameplay. Like Smash Brothers, in my opinion, is the biggest example, where it's like you have the competitive Smash, but it's so easy to play Smash Brothers against someone because the game doesn't necessarily ask you to learn all those hyper competitive mechanics just to play the game and beat your friends. So it's like, at the end of the day, if I just want to play against my friends and just have, or maybe like take the next competitive step, if the game allows me to still win games despite not putting in as much time as my opponent, as a casual player, that's all I really need to feel that kind of joy every so often in order to stay engaged. Because if I'm always getting my ass beat as someone that just doesn't have time to put in the time and effort into becoming one of the best, I will stop caring. I will simply become disengaged. And so you need to balance that. You need to kind of have a balance of not just catering for the competitive and the casual, but that big in-between. Because at the end of the day, the more casual player base is what grows the game. It is what the core audience is in the end. And at the end of the day, it's like, if you're only catering for the competitive, it's not going to actually sustain itself. Now, I do think that Vanguard should be enjoyed as much as possible. And I think that, having a more balanced format with more defensive mechanics is optimal. Again, as I said in the intro, I'm playing devil's advocate here, but maybe the existence of overtriggers and a faster format is Bushiroad's approach of going, okay, we don't want just the old heads and the people that put in all the time in this game to be always winning, so that's why we decided to introduce all these mechanics. That's why we've sped up this format in general, because that way, players that are less experienced, as long as they know it's like, oh, I can aggro early game, that will probably win me the game, okay, I'm gonna aggro. It's like, oh, you know, I can win by just like playing decks that drive check more, I guess I'll just do that, right? So it's like, it's not that they're necessarily making better decisions, but the game is built that way in order to reward that kind of player too. And a lot of people don't like that. A lot of people think that only the better players should be winning in these cases, but sometimes that's just not the case, right? The company chooses to approach it in their own way that they think is going to bring out the most amount of players to these events, and they're going to be, you know, the player base of these events isn't going to be just the competitive players. It's going to be people who just go to one BCS a year and they just want to have fun playing competitive Vanguard with whatever deck they chose, right? I feel like we can't really over-focus on this competitive player base at all times. And now this one's a bit more of a far-fetched argument, but there is, you know, on stream I sometimes like to talk about, like, I think I'll make a whole separate video about this, but whether fast gameplay is truly bad. And at the end of the day, there is, you know, we're talking about fighting games here already, but I like to bring up I like to compare Overdress, the standard format, with Guilty Gear Strive, where Guilty Gear is a fighting game series that in its past renditions was very player skill rewarding and overall a very intense combo based game where the good player would usually come out on top. And they still had some mechanics. There's a mechanic called Danger Time in the past that allowed you to kind of steal wins if you were careless. But they then introduced Guilty Gear Strive, which is the modern rendition of Guilty Gear, which just pumped damage numbers. Forget about defense. You're always just, you know, you hit your opponent twice successfully, you probably won the game, right? And it's very similar to what Vanguard's become a little bit with the standard format. It's like, oh, you get a couple good triggers, you get a good early game aggro, and just boom, explode, right? And that made me think, it's not just Vanguard that's doing this. There's also other games and other franchises that are just speeding games up. You look at like League of Legends clones, like for example Pokemon Unite, the game timer is 10 minutes. Everything's becoming faster, everything's becoming quicker. YouTube Shorts, TikTok, everything is becoming faster and more compartmentalized without necessarily spending a lot of time. Could this be that this is just how these media companies understand the core audience? Is it just that they, you know, everything has to be quicker and more available and faster in order to entertain the bigger audience? Maybe the TikTok youth is the future. You and I are just old, you know, bags of dust that are just gonna, you know, go into our gravestones eventually. We like our slow games, we like our decision making, but maybe the TikTok youth just wants to press buttons and win quick. Maybe the TikTok youth just wants to swing 3 times, check triggers, and win and, you know, get on to the next round, right? Maybe we're just the old ones. Maybe we're just past our prime. Maybe this is what these games, maybe this is the audience that this game is being built for now, and we just haven't realized it yet, you know? I think that's some things to think about, and yeah, Rush Duels, that's an interesting example too, right? And I think, you know, there's games that exist for people like you and me that enjoy that kind of competitive gameplay, right? One Piece TCG has a lot of good rep for being very, very competitively engaging. Shadow vs. Evolve 2, especially in the Japanese format, has become incredible to play. It's very, very satisfying, and you feel like you can always look back on the plays you make. Pokemon TCG 2, it's like definitely sped up quite a lot since its inception too. So maybe games becoming faster is just part of the natural progression, right? And that's just another thing to think about. Think about the TikTok youth, you know, does fast equal bad, or is this just the future direction of a lot of games and it's just Vanguard chose to take the deep dive first? So this has been an interesting video to make. I really want to hear your thoughts in the comments on this one. It's another one of these discussion videos. I've heard quite a few like them. I do know that the thumbnail and the title, etc., are a little clickbaity, but at the end of the day, this is the YouTube game, and if you don't play it, you lose. And unfortunately, I have goals and dreams, and getting you to click this video and watch it is one of them, so I greatly appreciate it. If you like the video, don't be afraid to give it a like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you want some bonus content, consider becoming a YouTube channel member to get access to all kinds of extra bonus goodies. And with that, that's gonna be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.